Jason was driving along an abandoned highway. The night was dark, and the rain was pounding on the roof of his old sedan. The radio barely picked up the signal, and the silence in the cabin became more and more depressing. He hadn't seen a single car in the last 2 hours, and the fuel gauge was slowly creeping down. He knew that if he couldn't find a gas station or a motel, he would spend the night in a car in the middle of the desert. When the neon sign of the Traveler's Paradise Motel appeared in the distance, Jason felt relieved. This place looked old-fashioned, but for the tired driver it seemed like a real salvation. The parking lot was almost empty, except for a couple of rusty cars that looked like they'd been there for decades. There was a strange silence inside the motel. The reception desk was shabby, with a worn, jangling bell. The receptionist, a middle-aged man with gray hair and cold eyes, was sitting at the counter, writing something in a journal. "Good evening. I need a room for one night," Jason said, putting his credit card on the counter. "Number 8. Second floor," the receptionist replied shortly, handing him a key with a faded keychain. His eyes met Jason's for a second, and he added, "There's no elevator, the stairs are on the right." As Jason climbed the stairs, he noticed a strange detail. The stairs creaked, as if someone had recently passed through here, even though the area was empty. The hallway on the second floor was narrow, and the walls seemed to absorb the sounds. Every step echoed hollowly, as if someone was following him. Room 8 looked standard, a bed with a sagging mattress, a bedside table with a telephone and a small TV. Jason threw his bag on the bed and decided to take a shower. The bathroom was old, with peeling paint on the walls and a cracked mirror. When he closed the door, he noticed the words scratched on the back of it. "Don't leave the lights off." This inscription caused him an unpleasant feeling, but he attributed it to teenagers who might have stayed here before. After the shower, he lay down on the bed and turned on the TV. There was local news. The host was talking about a series of murders in the area, but Jason didn't think much of it until he heard. The last incident occurred at a motel on Route 47. The police found the body of a man in room 8. Jason froze. This was the room where he was currently staying. He turned off the TV, feeling cold sweat trickle down his back. It seemed to him that something was moving outside the room. He got up and cautiously approached the door, listening. Through the crack under the door, he noticed a shadow moving back and forth. Jason squeezed the door handle, but didn't open it. Instead, he returned to the bed and tried to calm down. "It's just a motel employee or a neighbor," he thought. That night, Jason woke up to a strange sound. It was a rattling sound coming from the closet. He turned on the light and walked slowly to the door. When he opened it, there was nothing inside except an old coat, but the screeching stopped. He lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come anymore. Suddenly he heard a whisper. Someone was talking right at the door. "You're next." Jason jumped up, grabbed his phone and dialed 911. The operator answered, but the connection was immediately cut off. At that moment, the door of the room began to slowly open. A man in dirty clothes stood on the threshold, his face was stained with blood, and he was holding a knife in his hand. Jason rushed to the window, trying to open it, but the frames were boarded up. The stranger stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "This place, it chooses who stays," he whispered, approaching. In desperation, Jason grabbed a desk lamp and hit the man on the head. The stranger fell, but after a second he began to get up, as if the blow had not hit him. Jason ran out of the room, but the hallway was darker than before. He ran up the stairs, but instead of exiting, he found himself in another corridor. All the doors around him were closed, and there were traces of blood on some of them. He stopped at one of the doors from which the screams could be heard. When he opened it, he saw a woman tied up on a chair. There were deep cuts on her face. "Help me," she whispered. Before Jason could approach, the same man with a knife appeared around the corner. "You're not leaving here, and neither is she," he said, lunging at Jason. Jason desperately closed the door, holding it with his whole body. He understood that there was only one way out, to fight or die. Jason held the door fiercely, feeling the man on the other side trying his best to kick it down. His breathing quickened, and his hands were shaking, but he gathered the last of his strength and, loosening his grip, abruptly opened the door, hoping for a surprise. The attacker lost his balance and stumbled into the room. Jason wasted no time. He grabbed a nearby chair and hit it on the man's head. There was a dull crunch, and he fell, frozen. The woman in the chair began to cry softly. "We don't have much time. They'll be back," she whispered. "Who are they?" Jason asked, cutting the ropes that bound her. "The staff at this motel. They're not human. They catch people like you, leave us here to disappear." Her words sounded crazy, but Jason couldn't afford to doubt them. Something was really wrong with this place. As soon as he released the woman, the sound of heavy footsteps came from the hallway. She grabbed his arm and pulled him towards the window. "This is the only way," she said, pointing to a narrow fire escape. "It's boarded up," Jason objected, remembering his attempt to escape. "No, it's their trick. Try again." He pushed the frame with all his might, and the boards on the window suddenly gave way. The woman was the first to climb the stairs, followed by Jason. When they were outside, an icy wind hit them in the face. The stairs stretched down, but each step creaked so loudly that it seemed to wake up the whole motel. Halfway down, the fire exit door burst open with a bang, and two figures ran out. They were a man and a woman in staff uniforms. They had hammers in their hands. "Run! Stop it!" the woman screamed, accelerating her descent. Jason followed her, but the ladder suddenly creaked and broke. He managed to grab the edge, hanging on by his hands. A muddy area with broken concrete was waiting for him at the bottom. The woman turned around, but instead of helping, she screamed. "They're getting close." With the last of his strength, Jason pulled himself up and found himself back on the narrow metal frame. It was impossible to descend now. There was only one way to the roof of the neighboring building. "Jump!" A woman who was already standing on the roof shouted. Jason, without hesitation, ran and jumped. The blow was hard, but he survived. When he got up, the woman was already stepping back, looking somewhere behind him. "What have you done?" "What is it?" she whispered. Jason turned around and saw the motel receptionist standing on the edge of the roof. He was calm, as if being here was part of his plan. "Do you think this is the end?" "This is just the beginning," he said, and a strange smile appeared on his face. The woman grabbed Jason by the arm and dragged him to the edge of the roof, where there was a rope ladder. "Come down. Faster." As soon as they started to descend, the roof began to shake. The administrator, along with two other pursuers, was approaching, but the stairs were too long. They didn't make it. When Jason and the woman were on the ground, they ran towards the highway. This time they were lucky. The headlights of a truck flashed in the distance. They ran out onto the road, waving their arms. The truck stopped. "What's going on here?" the driver asked, clearly frightened by their appearance. "We need help. Get out of here," Jason shouted, jumping into the cockpit. When the truck started moving, they looked back. The Traveler's Paradise Motel disappeared into the darkness as if it had never existed. Jason thought the nightmare was over, but the woman next to him whispered, "They'll find us. They always do." The truck sped down the highway, its headlights cutting through the thick darkness. There was a tense silence in the cabin. The driver, an elderly man with a wrinkled face and a cigarette in his mouth, kept casting wary glances at Jason and the woman. "You look like you've escaped death. Who's chasing you? I'm sorry, he muttered. Jason looked at the woman, not knowing what to say. She beat him to it. The gang. They wanted to rob us. We barely left. A gang? The driver narrowed his eyes. I've been driving here for 20 years, I haven't seen any gangs here. It's true, Jason added, trying to sound convincing. They're hiding. The driver snorted, but didn't say anything else. The car sped off, leaving the motel and everything that had happened there behind. An hour later, the woman suddenly grabbed Jason by the arm. Do you hear that? What is it? She whispered. Jason listened, but apart from the hum of the engine, he heard nothing. What? They're watching. I'm sure. Come on, Jason tried to reassure her, even though he could feel the anxiety starting to rise inside. The driver turned off the engine, stopping the truck at an old diner on the side of the road. I need to rest. And you too. You look like you're about to fall. The diner was barely lit, and the neon letters on the sign were flashing, creating an ominous atmosphere. There was no one inside except for a tired-faced waitress and a couple of customers. Sit here, I'll be back soon, the driver said and walked away towards the toilets. Jason sat down at a table, looking around. The woman remained standing at the door, warily studying the street through the glass. You know this isn't the end, she said suddenly, without turning around. What are you talking about? They won't stop. We broke their rules. You know how that sounds, right? Jason began, but stopped when he noticed a shadow flickering outside the window. Listen to me, the woman turned sharply, her face contorted with fear. They're not human. They're like machines. They know where we're going. The door of the diner creaked open, and two men in gray jackets entered the room. They looked like ordinary visitors, but their cold gazes clung to every detail. Hush, the woman whispered, retreating to the counter. The waitress approached Jason with a notebook, but instead of asking about the order, she leaned closer and whispered. Are you from there too? Jason stared at her, dumbfounded. What? A motel. Are you from there? He nodded, not knowing what to say. The waitress quickly put a napkin on the table, on which it was written, "Do not go outside." They're already here. Jason felt a lump of fear rise in his throat. We have to leave, the woman whispered, grabbing his arm. But at that moment, one of the men in the gray jacket turned his head in their direction and froze. They've spotted us, she whispered. The man got up from the table and moved towards them. Jason jumped up, grabbing the woman by the hand, and together they ran to the door. But the second man was already standing in the way, blocking the exit. Over here. The waitress shouted, pointing at the back door. They rushed there, feeling their pursuers literally breathing down their backs. The back door led them into a narrow alley. The driver's car was still in place, but when Jason and the woman ran up to the cab, the driver was already dead, his body mutilated beyond recognition. Damn it! Jason cursed, looking around. They're very close. A woman shouted, and at that moment men in gray jackets appeared from the alley. Without thinking, Jason started the truck. The engine roared, and he hit the gas. The wheel spun, kicking up gravel, and the car took off, almost knocking over one of the pursuers. What now? Stop it, he shouted, turning to the woman. We have to find a place where they can't find us. But there are almost no such places left, she replied, squeezing into the seat. The truck sped along the highway, immersed in the absolute silence of the night. Jason tightened his grip on the steering wheel, glancing briefly at the woman, who was now holding a knife taken from the cockpit and peering intently into the side mirrors. What makes you so sure they won't leave? What is it? He asked, trying to collect his thoughts. You don't understand who we're messing with. These are not just people. They're She paused, looking at the headlights ahead. "Stop it." Jason slammed on the brakes. A police car was parked on the road with its flashing lights on. The silhouette of a uniformed officer got out of the car and raised his hand, signaling to stop. "We're lucky," Jason muttered, rolling down the window. But the woman abruptly grabbed his hand, squeezing it with force. "No. Don't say anything." The officer came closer, his face was hidden under his cap, and his voice sounded too monotonous. "Good evening. Have you violated something?" "No, officer, it's just..." Jason began, but suddenly noticed that the badge on the policeman's uniform was missing. The woman pushed open the door on the other side of the cabin and ran out, disappearing into the darkness. "Hey!" Jason shouted, trying to stop her. The policeman, ignoring her escape, continued to stare at Jason. "You need to go back. It's safer there," he said in a cold, lifeless voice. Jason felt cold sweat trickle down his back. It wasn't a policeman. Suddenly, the officer reached for his holster, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a knife with a long curved blade. Jason didn't wait. He pressed the gas pedal all the way down, overtaking the figure of the policeman, who did not even try to jump to the side. The truck took off onto a deserted country road, the headlights illuminating only a narrow lane ahead. Jason had barely turned when the figure of a woman appeared in front of him. "Are you crazy?" "Stop it," he shouted, stopping. She looked scared, but tough. Her fingers were still clutching the same knife. "It's not over, Jason. We found the worst place to be. Why didn't you tell me about this before?" "Because now we have no choice," she whispered, nodding at the gloomy figure standing on the hill ahead. For a moment, it seemed like it was just another stalker. But Jason noticed the details, a knife dripping with something dark, tattered clothes, and a face full of calmness. The woman suddenly turned pale. "That's him." "Who is he?" "A maniac. They work for him. This is their leader." Before Jason could understand anything, the man on the hill raised his hand. Other figures began approaching the truck from different directions, men and women in gray jackets, armed with knives and crowbars. "Damn it! Get in the car." The woman rushed back into the cab, and Jason hit the gas again, driving a few meters away from the figure on the hill. "Are you sure this isn't the end?" "Stop it," he shouted, as an eerie hum of voices sounded behind them, as if it were an alarm for their death. "They won't stop until they get what they want." "And what is it?" She looked at him in silence, and Jason suddenly realized that he would never know the truth. Ahead, the road split. One path led back to the highway, the other into a dense forest. "Which way?" "Into the woods," she said. "They hate the forest." Jason didn't understand why, but he obeyed. The truck flew into the narrow road, cutting through bushes and branches that whipped against the windows. But they weren't alone. From behind, in the headlights, he could see their silhouettes, dozens of figures racing after them at superhuman speed. Jason could feel his heart pounding with panic. The woman in the cab next to him pressed herself against the door, as if she was going to jump out at any moment, but she held on. "Who are they?" His voice was shaking, but his gaze was focused on the road, on every pothole and pothole that could send them into a ditch. "Do you really want to know? Or do you want to survive?" The woman looked at him from under her brows. The truck flew onto a forest road, the trees closed over them in a dense corridor through which the moonlight barely penetrated. The headlights picked out bushes and driftwood, but something was moving ahead. "Damn it!" Jason swerved sharply, feeling the rear wheels start to slip. A man stood in front with a crowbar in his hands. Without moving, he just waited for the truck to crash. Jason pulled the car back onto the road, narrowly missing him, and glanced in the rearview mirror. The man didn't even move, as if he knew they would come back. "They're just playing with us," the woman muttered, clutching the knife. "Who are they?" Jason shouted again, his voice cracking. "The people who pay for these motels. Those who wait for people like us." "What are you talking about?" She closed her eyes, as if she was going to tell something that had been hiding inside for a long time. "These places. These are not just motels. These are traps. And everyone who goes there becomes a part of the game." "Games? Are you kidding? Listen up." She grabbed his arm. "Did you see how this policeman didn't even dodge? How did those figures stand as if they were waiting for us? These are not random people, they are organized." "Who organized them?" She was silent. At that moment, there was a loud crack. The branches ahead broke under the pressure of something heavy. Jason slammed on the brakes. A truck was parked in front of them. His cabin was empty, but the engine was running. "It's them," the woman whispered, her face turning white. "They what?" She opened the door and ran into the woods, leaving him alone. Jason didn't know what to do. He looked at the abandoned truck, at the headlights that blinded him, and felt something around him becoming unbearably quiet. Suddenly, a man came out from behind the truck. His face was expressionless, and he was wearing a work uniform. But there was something strange about his movements, slow but purposeful. Jason didn't wait. He turned his truck around, intending to brake back onto the highway. But the road was blocked. Four cars were parked bumper to bumper, blocking the way. "Damn it!" Jason slammed on the steering wheel. He opened the cabin door and ran into the woods. Branches whipped at his face, and his feet slid on the damp ground. He could hear footsteps behind him. Someone was chasing him, but he didn't look back. After a few minutes of running, he came across a house. It was a small wooden cottage, covered with moss and almost merging into the forest. Jason stormed inside, slamming the door behind him. "Help me!" "Stop it!" he shouted, but there was nothing inside. The room looked abandoned. Dust covered the furniture, and torn newspapers littered the floor. He walked over to the table where the notebook was lying. Opening it, Jason began to read. "If you're here, it's too late. They won't stop. These are not people. This is..." Then the text was torn up, as if someone had torn out the page in a hurry. Suddenly, there was a creak of floorboards. Jason whirled around. "Who's there?" His voice was trembling. A figure appeared in the shadow of the doorway. She took a step forward, and Jason recognized the woman. "You left me," he shouted, but her face was different. "Empty." She raised the knife. "It's the only way out," she whispered. Jason froze, his breathing coming in short gasps. The woman in front of him held a knife as if it was the only tool capable of ending their agony. "What are you doing?" he croaked, trying to hold her gaze. "You don't understand." Her voice became emotionless, her eyes empty. "They'll never let us go." There was a soft creaking sound from behind, as if someone had walked across the floor behind him. Jason turned around, but saw no one. "Who's here?" The voice betrayed him, trembling in the silence. "It doesn't matter." The woman slowly came closer, the knife still in her hands. "Only one thing is important. We are already a part of it." "What?" Jason shouted, stepping back until his back hit the wall. "What's going on?" She looked at him, and tears glistened in her eyes. "We're the next story," she whispered, and her lips twitched as if she couldn't believe her own words. At that moment, all the doors in the house abruptly flew open. A draft filled the room, blowing newspapers off the floor. Jason turned around, his eyes searching for a way out, but there was only silence. The woman took another step forward. "You can run if you want. But remember, they already know your name." Jason rushed to the door, his legs barely obeying him. He flew out into the street and ran deep into the forest, not understanding the road. Every branch, every rustle seemed like the sounds of a chase. He ran until he was on the road. He saw headlights in the distance. The car. Hope flared up inside him, and he waved his arms, running out into the middle of the road. The car stopped. The driver slowly opened the window. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his voice calm. Jason, covered in dirt and wounds, leaned against the car door. "Help me. I'm being hunted." The man nodded, took out a bottle of water from the glove compartment and handed it to Jason. "Get in, I'll drive you." Jason collapsed into the passenger seat, his head falling against the back. He could feel the adrenaline gradually leaving his body. "Thanks," he muttered, looking out the window. The car started moving. But after a few minutes, Jason noticed that the road looked familiar. Too familiar. "Where are we going?" "What is it?" he asked, trying to keep calm. The man looked at him for a moment, and Jason saw a cold, emotionless expression in his eyes. "To where you need to be," he replied, turning onto the very forest road that started it all. The truck stopped at a familiar motel. The lights were on in the windows. The car door locked with a distinctive click.